Who is your neighbor? You might be wondering, why is that a question? Who is my neighbor? Do we know who our neighbors are? Do we know how they are doing? Hey, Pastor David here again, wanting to bring a little encouragement and perhaps a little challenge from the Word of God. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the story that we find recorded in Luke chapter 10, where a teacher of the law is coming to Jesus and asking him about the greatest commandment. Jesus quickly goes on to summarize that the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God, and the second is equal to it, to love your neighbor as yourself. So then we read in verse 29, wanting to justify himself, he was asking Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Wanting to justify himself, some dangerous words there. It is very easy for us to consider where we find ourselves, consider challenges and difficulties in life, and justifying our actions, justifying our attitude and behavior, and so on. But Jesus doesn't let him get away with that. So after he asks that question, Jesus takes the learning opportunity right in front of him and goes on to tell the story that we know as the story of the Good Samaritan. So when he is done telling the story, the teacher of the law is kind of in the corner and recognizes that he needs to be a good neighbor to the people that he was looking down upon, people that he considered inferior, unclean, different, and just not as good as he was. I have to stop today and think, if we were to ask Jesus today, who is my neighbor? Who would he point us to? Would he point us to a people of a different color? Would he point us to a people who have a different outlook in our life today? Would he point us to a people that are struggling as we are, but struggling with something entirely different than you and I are? Where would he point us towards? Well, we can recognize that at the heart of the story of what Jesus is telling this teacher is that when he is thinking about his neighbor, he needs to look at someone who is in need. The story of the Good Samaritan is where this Samaritan man is finding himself in misfortunes and in desperate need of help. Who is your neighbor? Who is my neighbor? Do we know what they're struggling with? Do we know what they need help with? In the time and age that we're living in, we all struggle. We all need help. And unfortunately, we live in a time where we're extremely divided. And it is very easy for us to look at someone else who struggles differently than we are and look down upon them, criticize them, divide over things that we shouldn't be dividing over. Now, the beautiful thing about loving your neighbor as Christ did is it brings solutions. It brings reconciliation. It brings redemption. Now, that can only happen when we are wanting to be instrumental in showing our love to our neighbor. Forgetting about what our differences are, forgetting about where their perspective of life is different than ours, but showing love to them in tangible, practical ways. How can we help them? How can we be an encouragement to them? The divided and confused world that we live in, where people have forgotten what love is all about, where people have forgotten what it looks like to be reconciled to Christ, to be reconciled to one another, is an opportunity for you and me as followers of Christ to show the love of Christ, the genuine love that brings hope and life to us, because somebody showed it to us, but also to our neighbors who may be different than us, but need it just as much as we do. So let us look across the fence, across the street, across the table, maybe across town, and consider who is our neighbor that looks different than I do, and how will we show love to them in a way that Christ explained to show love to one another. Blessings as you go.